Have you ever wondered why, after a spiritual awakening, what once felt like your greatest passion suddenly seems like a foreign object in your hands? Why the paintbrush that used to be your refuge now feels like a mute tool? Why the music that once lifted you suddenly becomes nothing more than soulless noise? Or why the hobbies that once defined you now appear as faded disguises? Carl Gustav Jung, with the precision of an explorer of the psyche's depths, discovered something astonishing. Spiritual awakening does not revitalize your hobbies, it dissolves them. In his studies, he observed that nearly 80% of people who experienced a shift in consciousness abandoned, within months, the very activities that once seemed indispensable to them. Not out of lack of talent or motivation, but because they suddenly realized that these passions were playgrounds of the ego, a stage where masks of the so-called self were displayed. He called this moment the death of the hobby. That instant when the canvas remains untouched, the guitar produces empty tones and everything that once defined you reduces itself to a web of elaborate distractions. Perhaps you had imagined that awakening would unleash an explosion of creativity, but instead it swept away what once gave you identity. Perhaps now you look at your old tools of expression and feel they no longer belong to you. Maybe the colors gather dust on the shelf, while within you an unsettling silence spreads. And yet, Jung found in the midst of this emptiness a revelation. This creative death is not failure, it is rebirth. The psyche is forced to shatter the shells of the ego so that the authentic self, which needs no masks, can finally be born. Before we continue with the video, I want you to write one word in the comments: rebirth. Write it from the soul, from the heart. Because every time we share this word, we remind ourselves that what feels like a loss is, in truth, the preparation for something greater that is growing within us. Rebirth is not just a change. It is the chance to begin again authentically without masks so that the truest part of you can blossom. When you write it, you are not simply leaving a comment. You are affirming that your life too carries the power of transformation, that your being can bloom anew with more light and depth. Write rebirth in the comments, feel its strength, and stay until the end of this video because what follows could change the way you see your inner path. Before awakening, your hobbies were more than just activities. They were the building blocks of your identity. Musician, athlete, artist, collector. Each title was a mask, a necessary disguise to present yourself to the world. They served you like crutches, supporting a self that was not yet aware of its true nature. When someone asked you who you were, your answer spoke not of consciousness or soul, but of what you did. You took photographs, you trained, you played guitar. Your hobbies were your identity because the deeper self remained hidden under layers of conditioning and the need for validation. Jung repeatedly observed how this pattern unfolded. People described themselves by what they produced, not by what they were. And this is precisely what awakening dismantles, because only through the collapse of the old persona can the naked truth of being emerge. The loss can feel devastating. It is not simply about giving up a hobby, but about witnessing the dissolution of the roots of your identity. That is why this transition feels threatening. It is not just an activity that collapses, but the very foundation of what you believed yourself to be. Yet Jung saw it clearly. Letting go of these impulses is a necessary step. The old passions were fueled by what he called the motivation of the ego, the desire for recognition, the need to stand out, the urge to escape discomfort. You painted because the finished picture made you seem talented. You made music because applause filled the emptiness. You trained because your reflection in the mirror gave you the illusion of strength. Each passion hid, like a refined mechanism, the ego's desperate search for meaning. And when consciousness expands, this fuel evaporates like smoke in the air. Jung described this phenomenon as a motivational reorientation, the shift from the compulsions of the ego to the inspirations of the soul. That is why it is so difficult to explain when someone asks why you no longer paint or train. There is no simple answer because the part of you that once craved success or recognition has dissolved. What once fed your hunger for validation has lost its power, as if you had awakened from a dream. And yet this is not a final death, but a necessary cleansing. After decades of analysis, Jung recognized that the old motivation had to die because it was built on dependency. Only by detaching from it does space open for a true impulse, free of chains, born not from fear but from deep authenticity. The in-between phase, that desert where nothing seems to make sense, is in truth a place of birth. Many experience it as emptiness, but Jung described it as the antechamber of a new kind of creativity, one that no longer needs masks or applause. Even more unsettling was his next observation. Many hobbies were not just masks of the ego, but what he called shadow managers, unconscious strategies to hide unbearable feelings. Painting concealed loneliness, music drowned out fear, sports erased helplessness. Games replaced the complexity of human relationships. On the surface, all of this seemed healthy and productive, but at its core, it was emotional pain relief, escape mechanisms disguised as passion. Here, Jung's truth becomes sharper than ever. Spiritual awakening does not only shatter the masks of the ego, it also destroys the refuges where the shadow once hid. When a hobby dies, it is not only a role that vanishes, but also the invisible anesthetic you once used to survive. At first, this loss hurts like an amputation, yet it is at the same time the most radical liberation. It is the chance to see yourself without masks, to feel without escape routes, to exist without the old numbing agents. It is the beginning of a rebirth in which creativity, if it returns, will no longer be a game of the ego or a hiding place for the shadow, but the free voice of a soul that finally recognizes itself. And what if you discovered that your hobbies were never what you thought they were, but locked doors to your inner being? What if when you tried to take them up again you found no comfort and no distraction, but exactly what you most feared to feel? Jung's concept of the shadow, those wounds, fears, and hidden emotions we bury because they threaten our self-image, explains why spiritual awakening smashes these escape mechanisms. With expanded consciousness, the shadow stops hiding and demands to be seen. You sit down to paint, and instead of losing yourself in the colors, the loneliness you avoided for years steps forward. You pick up the guitar, and instead of flowing in the music, the sadness you always fled appears. Jung called this threshold the confrontation with the shadow. The moment in which awakening forces you to feel without escape what your hobbies had always protected you from. It is a process that provokes fear, because for the first time you can no longer distract yourself from your inner reality. What collapses are not just leisure activities, but your most essential coping strategies. The tools you once used to keep emotions at a distance no longer work, and you stand naked before the mirror of your being. And yet this exposure is necessary. You cannot heal as long as you keep running from half of yourself. That is why your hobbies had to lose their meaning. Only this way could the space open in which you finally face what you have long repressed. On the other side of this integration awaits an entirely new creativity, one born not of escape, but of wholeness. Jung understood that this loss experienced by many as destructive is part of what mystics called the dark night of the soul. He translated it into psychological language and called it the collapse of meaning. Not only your hobbies die, but the entire value system that sustained them. What once gave you direction, winning competitions, finishing projects, receiving applause, suddenly collapses because your consciousness has shifted to another level. Jung documented this pattern across cultures, ages, and people. Every true spiritual transformation inevitably passes through a phase in which the old sources of meaning become worthless, psychologically empty. Before awakening, you followed what Jung called collective values, invisible rules dictating what was valuable, what one should strive for, what supposedly promised fulfillment, creative achievements, athletic victories, special skills. All of it seemed like a path to completeness. But awakening unmasks the truth. These values were social constructions, not essential truths. Hobbies resting on these foundations lose their weight. You can no longer force yourself to care about what feels inwardly empty. Jung called this phenomenon the collision with meaninglessness, the moment when what once glittered now appears hollow because it was built on unexamined assumptions. Perhaps you catch yourself staring at your paints from your bed, unable to feel the smallest impulse. Your consciousness has left behind the old value system that gave them life, but a new one has not yet been born. Jung compared this stage to a psychological winter, a time of withdrawal and decomposition when the old dies so that the new can grow. Hobbies belong to this dying system and must disappear before genuine passions can arise.
The fascinating part, this lesson is not an end, but a seed. In the barren space where your former interests have withered, something new is already ripening in the silence, waiting for its moment.
Here lies Jung's visionary strength. The death of ego-driven hobbies creates space for what he called authentic self-expression, activities that do not serve escape or recognition, but burst forth from the true self. Jung drew a clear distinction between the activities of the persona which serve the social mask, and those of the self which spring from the deepest truth. Before awakening, most of your hobbies were in fact mask work disguised as genuine interest. But when the persona collapses in awakening, fertile ground opens for another kind of creativity. Impulses, flowing directly from the soul, you no longer create to prove something, but to express what you are. You no longer act to achieve a goal, but because the action itself becomes being. Jung called this process individuation. Arriving at one's own center, the shift from I should to I am. Your hobbies had to die because they served the should. What now arises belongs to the am. That is why trying to revive old interests feels like wearing clothes that no longer fit. Not because your body has changed, but because your consciousness has grown. Jung found that true self-expression rarely resembles old hobbies. The ambitious athlete discovers the silence of solitary walks in nature. The stage musician feels drawn to the quiet of meditation. These new activities are not hobbies in the traditional sense. They do not exist to achieve, to perform, or to feed an identity, but as ways of being, channels through which essence flows into the world. He called them self-realization activities, pathways of expression through which true nature reveals itself. But he warned insistently, this emergence cannot be rushed. The true self reveals itself in its own rhythm. The task is not to force new passions, but to remain receptive to what is quietly beginning to take shape within you. To cross this threshold, Jung gave concrete guidance. First, the mourning of the persona. Accept that something real has died. Not just hobbies, but the part of you that needed them to feel complete. This mourning is sacred because it honors the depth of transformation. Pretending that the old could return would mean denying the chance of rebirth. True metamorphosis requires letting go of what no longer carries life. Second, Jung taught making the shadow an ally. Instead of avoiding the feelings your hobbies once numbed, he suggested building a conscious relationship with them. If you painted to escape loneliness, then learn to look it in the eye. If you played to avoid fear, then stay with it without running away. For it is precisely in this presence that the shadow is integrated. And in this integration, the self finds the freedom to bloom without masks. And what if what you now experience as a collapse were not in fact a loss, but the unmistakable sign that your life has entered a deeper phase? What if the apparent death of your hobbies were at its core a call from your own psyche to realign yourself with a more authentic way of living? Jung discovered that when you stop fleeing from the shadow feelings you once covered with distractions, something surprising happens. These repressed emotions do not destroy you. They transform into creative energy. Loneliness becomes a source of depth. Fear becomes sensitivity. Sadness turns into compassion. It is as if what you always rejected had secretly carried within it the seed of renewed life force. At this point, Jung recommended a third and decisive step: true experimentation. the courage to try things you never considered before, not to stand out or to dominate, but to feel what resonates with the new self emerging within you. Perhaps it is writing without any intention of publishing, tending a garden without applause, cooking without perfection, walking without destination, or simply sitting in silence. For Jung, this openness was the essence of active imagination, allowing your deepest self to play with new forms of expression without pressure to perform, without the mask of success. It is not about collecting new hobbies, but about opening paths through which your essence wishes to reveal itself to the world. This phase of integration requires patience and trust. Genuine interests arise only when your psyche is ready to carry them. Forcing them brings you back into the game of the persona. Allowing them leads you to the authentic discovery of the self. Here, Jung made a crucial distinction: the two halves of life. The first half is dedicated to building the ego, developing a career, gaining status, adapting to social expectations, accumulating achievements that give stability to identity. But then comes the second half, the evening of life, which demands a radical change. Now it is no longer about conquering the outer world, but about descending into the depth of inner meaning. Jung observed that people who do not make this transition often fall into existential crisis. They try to keep playing the games of the morning with the consciousness of the evening, and they fail. In this sense, the death of hobbies can be read as a call into this more mature phase of human development. In the morning of life, hobbies serve a vital function for the ego. They train you, strengthen your confidence, help you build social connections, and define your identity. But in the evening of life, activities must follow a different voice. They must serve the soul. They transform into tools of self-knowledge, expressions of authenticity, practices that create inner meaning.
That is why old hobbies feel lifeless when you try to revive them with the consciousness of the evening.
This is natural. What once served the I should has no place in the I am. Jung found that people who successfully make this transition discover entirely new activities. Instead of competitive sports, they are drawn to the stillness of nature. Instead of social gatherings, they seek spaces of contemplation. Instead of accumulating skills, they turn toward wisdom. Often this shift is marked by crisis, the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, health challenges, or even a spiritual awakening. What looks like a breakdown on the surface is at its depth a movement toward a more meaningful life. Jung understood this clearly. You do not lose the capacity for joy or devotion. You simply move beyond the forms that belong to an earlier stage of life. What now seeks to unfold in you is a deeper engagement, one suited to the maturity of your consciousness. That is why the death of hobbies is not a sign of illness, but proof that your psychological development is unfolding in a healthy way. Your soul is calling you inward to a place more integrated and true. The process of integration begins with Big Bow, as Jung emphasized, with grieving the persona. You must acknowledge that something real has died, not only outer activities, but the version of yourself that needed them to feel complete. This grief is sacred because it honors the transformation taking place at the core of your being. It is useless to pretend the old interest will simply return or to force yourself to revive outdated patterns. True metamorphosis requires letting go of everything before the new can be born. The second step is to make the shadow your friend. Where you once painted to escape loneliness or played to numb fear, you are now called to sit consciously with loneliness and remain present with fear. Jung realized when you stop fleeing these feelings, they transform into creative power. Loneliness reveals its depth, fear becomes sensitivity, sadness turns into compassion. The third step is genuine experimentation, opening yourself to the unexpected. You may discover that writing a few lines, working with the earth, cooking without hurry, walking aimlessly, or sitting silently are practices that resonate with your new being. Jung called this active imagination, the willingness to give your soul room to play and express itself without the compulsion to be productive or useful. The great revelation of Jung is this: the death of old hobbies is not an end, but a psychological rebirth. What emerges from this process is not the shattered version of your former self, but the true form of what you always were beneath the masks. The hobbies served their purpose. They gave you identity, recognition, and escape routes for as long as you needed them. But awakening means this: you no longer need external supports in order to feel whole. You can now create, act, and live, no longer out of lack, but out of inner abundance. Jung called this integrated creativity, the ability to animate the world from the deepest authenticity so that every action becomes the direct expression of the soul. And what if what you think you lost is nothing more than the prelude to something deeper? What if the silence of your guitar, the dusty paintbrushes, or the apparent death of your hobbies are not signs of emptiness, but proof that something new is already germinating within you? Jung discovered that activities, when they return after awakening, transformed no longer as compensation but as expression. Painting can return, yes, but as quiet meditation, not as a desperate attempt to gain approval. Music may return, but not as a stage to feed the ego, instead as a voice rising from the soul. Even movement may resurface, but not as a rehabilitation program, rather as a celebration of the body, as a spontaneous dance with life itself. People who undergo this transition often become more creative than ever before, but their creativity no longer serves image, success, or lack. It now serves life, authenticity, and love. This is why Jung did not view the death of hobbies as a loss, but as a gift. It forces you to see the fundamental difference between doing to prove and doing to express. A seemingly subtle distinction that changes everything. Jung documented this pattern over decades as one of the most reliable signs of psychological maturity. The moment when a person stops depending on external activities to feel valuable and instead begins to offer a genuine, authentic gift to the world. This threshold, painful as it may be, is one of the most meaningful transitions a human being can experience. So once again, Jung observed that spiritual awakening does not revive your hobbies, it kills them. And now you know why these pursuits served a version of you that was driven by compulsion, nourished by escape from the shadow, and sustained by masks that had to dissolve through the expansion of consciousness. You are not broken simply because you can no longer force yourself to paint. You are not lazy just because your guitar is gathering dust in the corner. You are not depressed simply because your old passions have gone out. What is happening runs deeper. You are undergoing a psychological process of development. Jung saw it clearly. The death of hobbies is in truth a birth, the emergence of an authentic self that no longer needs external supports to feel whole. What appears to be a creative death is in fact creative preparation. Your soul had to destroy the ego-driven hobbies before genuine forms of expression could emerge from the depths of your being. The emptiness you feel now is not eternal nothingness. It is fertile soil. Something new is beginning to grow where once your old interests lived. Jung devoted his life to understanding and guiding this transformation because he recognized it as one of the most important psychic movements of human existence. You are not losing your creativity. You are ascending to a purer, more real, more integrated creativity. The question is not how to become what you once were. The true question is, what wants to move through you now, when you are no longer dependent on external validation to feel complete, and when you are ready to embrace this change. Jung's advice is clear. Be patient with the emptiness. Honor the dying. Trust the process. Something true is seeking to unfold within you, and that can only happen if you release the old, which no longer corresponds to your awakened awareness. If this message speaks to you, share it with someone who needs it. Sometimes, the most healing thing we can do is to speak into another person's heart. You are not broken. You are crossing a threshold. Your true self is worth every false passion you once cultivated. Jung knew this, and perhaps now you can understand it too. Have you ever looked in the mirror and felt that the reflection had nothing to do with who you really are? Have you tried to revive what once made you vibrate, only to find yourself facing an inexplicable emptiness. This is the story of Javier, an ordinary man who suddenly crossed the most unsettling threshold of his life, the death of his hobbies, a death that confused him, but that led him to the deepest lesson Carl Gustav Jung ever described, the birth of the authentic self. Javier had always been a passionate man. Music was his refuge since youth. He spent hours with his guitar, losing himself in chords that gave him a sense of purpose. At family gatherings, he was the musician who lit up the event, earning applause and smiles. Among friends, he showed another side, the tireless athlete. He ran marathons, trained with discipline, and every medal on the shelf confirmed that he was doing it right, that he was valuable. His hobbies were not mere pastimes. They formed a center of his identity. But one day, without warning, something changed. The guitar sounded hollow in his hands. The training that once filled him with energy became an unbearable routine. The songs he wrote no longer moved him. The kilometers he ran seemed endless, and every applause felt empty, as if everything that had once defined him had suddenly become meaningless. Javier thought he was depressed. Perhaps it was exhaustion, he told himself. But no matter how much he rested, the spark did not return. The outer world seemed unchanged. Yet inside him, everything had gone dark. And precisely in this darkness, where Javier thought he had lost everything, the essential began to reveal itself. What looked like the end of his creativity was in truth the beginning of a new depth. The emptiness that tormented him was not punishment, but transition, the silence before another melody, one no longer born of ego but of his soul. Jung would have said, in this moment, the old persona shatters so that the true self can finally speak. Javier had to learn to be still, to give space to the pain, and to trust that the emptiness itself was fertile ground. Today he understands that he lost nothing. He only stopped defining himself through external roles. His creativity has not disappeared. It has transformed. It no longer serves applause or the image he once built of himself, but flows as an honest expression from his depth. This is Jung's message. The death of your hobbies is not an end, but a calling. A call to live authentically, free of masks and dependencies, and to have the courage to recognize yourself in your truth. If you find yourself in this story, remember, you are not broken. You are on the path to